It begins somewhere in a room that almost no one sees. The lights of the city have gone soft outside the high windows, a faint glow pressing at the glass. But in here, the world is smaller, closer, lit by a single lamp over a scuffed wooden table. On that table lies an object that should not look the way it does. It is a blade, the kind you might walk past in a museum case without a second glance, fashioned from iron long before your grandparents' were born. It has lived in damp soil, in brackish water, under roofs that leaked for decades. It has been forgotten more times than anyone alive has been remembered. By every rule you have been taught, it should be crumbling. Iron meets air, iron meets water, and the slow red hunger of rust begins. Tools left in gardens flake away. Ship hulls bubble and peel. Even the metal in your own home carries faint scars of time. Yet this blade lies under the lamplight, with a surface the color of storm clouds and oil, dark and strangely smooth, as if it has drawn a thin midnight skin over itself. Gloved hands turn it, slowly. An archaeologist remembers the day it was first uncovered, the way the soil parted around it, clinging to the metal, as if reluctant to let it go. A curator leans closer, breath held, searching for the familiar bloom of corrosion and finding instead shallow lines and a sheen that swallows the light rather than reflecting it. A metallurgist peers through magnified lenses, waiting for the instruments to confirm what the eyes already suspect, and the numbers refuse to tell a simple story. This iron should be tired. It should be pitted and frail, surrendered to the elements that never sleep. Instead, it seems composed, almost patient, like something that understands the soul language of centuries. You can imagine it resting in darkness while empires rose and fell overhead, while maps were redrawn, while entire languages faded from memory. The roof above it changed, the faiths above it changed, but whatever was done to this metal has held. Perhaps it is just a trick of conditions, you think. Perhaps the soil was kind, the air gentle, the water unusually pure. That is what we are told to assume. That if something endures, it is because the world around it made an exception. Yet somewhere in the mind, another thought stirs. What if the exception is not outside the blade, but within it? What if someone long ago, standing in front of a fire we will never see, knew how to make iron that does not behave the way ours does? The room falls quieter, though no one speaks. The instruments keep humming. The lamp keeps shining. But there is a sense that the blade is no longer an object on a table. It is a question laid gently in front of you. If this piece of iron refused to die when every rule says it should have, what else have we misunderstood about the materials that hold our world together? And about the people who first learned to shape them? The lamplight dims. The dark surface of the blade softens into shadow. Somewhere behind it, beyond it, the scene loosens at the edges, and the years begin to roll backward. The table fades, the instruments dissolve, and the cold and controlled light of the present is replaced by a harsher glow, the breathing orange of a forge just waking, and the echo of a hammer being raised for the very first blow. The sound reaches you before the picture appears. At first, it is a hollow ringing in the dark, a single note rising and falling like a distant pulse. Then another joins it, and another, until the rhythm becomes steady enough to feel in your chest. Somewhere beyond the present, iron is meeting iron, and every strike is a word in an old language. The darkness thickens into smoke. The cold museum light dissolves, replaced by a glow spilling from a stone forge. You are standing at the edge of an older room. The floor is hard-packed earth, scattered with ash and coal. Outside, night presses against a wooden door. Inside, the air trembles with heat. Between fire and anvil moves a single figure, the blacksmith, calm as someone repeating a prayer. He holds the iron in long tongs, the metal glowing a deep orange. His face is lined, not with age alone, but with focus. Each swing of the hammer lands where it must, remembered by muscle and bone. Sparks leap away and die before they touch the ground. To anyone watching from the doorway, it looks like simple labor. To the iron, it is closer to conversation. In another village, snow leans against the walls of a mountain forge. Inside, a different smith shapes nails, hinges, and tools while the valley sleeps. Without his work, doors would not hold, roofs would not stay, plows would not bite the soil. Travelers bring him broken metal. He sends them away with blades renewed, edges corrected, weight balanced in the hand. No one calls him a magician, but everyone steps softer near his fire. Elsewhere, behind temple walls, a quieter forge glows. Here, metal becomes bells, ritual knives, objects that will never plow a field or ride to war. Before the hammer lifts, the smith closes his eyes, as if asking leave from something unseen. When he begins, his hands are as sure as a warrior's. The tools that leave this place will hang in sanctuaries and echo through ceremonies. Yet almost no one will wonder how they were born. Across lands and years, the pattern repeats. In towns, forts, and lonely valleys, blacksmiths stand at the crossing point between raw earth and sharpened purpose. War, harvest, worship, and survival pass through their hands. People rely on them, praise them, fear displeasing them. A person who can bend rigid metal, who can make it soft and then hard again at will, holds a strange place in a community. Half craftsman, half gatekeeper. We are told to picture these men as simple workers, backs bent, arms burning, repeating motions without thought. But as the hammer keeps falling and the iron changes color under every blow, another image forms. You begin to notice the pauses, the tilt of the head, the way the smith judges the glow with nothing more than his eyes. Maybe the real work is not only in the strength of the arm, but in the choices no one else can see. Small shifts in heat, timing, and touch, passed from master to apprentice in low voices. The blade on the anvil darkens, its brightness fading from white to orange, from orange to red, from red to a breathing warmth. The smith lifts it, turns it once as if listening, then lowers it into a waiting trough. There is a hiss, and a cloud of steam wraps the metal in secrecy. One simple act. Hot iron meets liquid. Hidden inside that brief collision waits an older story, told by the force waiting in every drop of water and every breath of air. Rust does not hurry, but it never stops. Imagine a nail left on a windowsill, a bicycle forgotten behind a shed, a fence post standing year after year in the rain. At first, nothing seems to change. Then a faint roughness appears, a smear of color that was not there before. Orangey creeps across gray, like a slow bruise. What you are seeing is iron meeting the world and losing. Oxygen in the air, moisture in the wind and on your skin. Reach for the metal until the surface gives way. In simple terms, rust is iron joining with oxygen, to become something new. Tiny reactions bloom wherever air and water touch bare metal. A scratch in paint, a chipped corner, a place where coating wears thin. These are openings, doors left unlocked. Once rust starts, it spreads. It lifts and cracks the layers above it, making room for more air, more water, more change. Given enough time, a solid bar can turn into flakes, and dust you could sweep away. Modern life is full of small battles against this slow appetite. Cars are coated, bridges sealed, ships painted and repainted. We add other elements to iron to make steel that resists a little longer. We smear on oils, wrap parts in plastic, hide important pieces inside walls. We treat rust like a nuisance we can push back with effort and chemistry. Yet go to any harbour, any abandoned lot, any forgotten machine, and you will see how often we lose. Under ordinary conditions, that is the rule. Exposed iron surrenders. Leave a cheap tool outside through one winter, and you will feel it in your hand the next year, the surface rough, the strength faded. When experts talk about ancient metal, they carry this rule with them. An iron blade buried in damp soil for centuries should be little more than a stain. A pillar left in open air should be heavily scarred, its skin broken and pitted. But every rule, if it is real, should apply everywhere. That is where the unease begins. Here and there, scattered through museums, temples, and private collections, are objects that did not follow the script. Iron that stood in the open and did not crumble as expected. Tools lifted from wet ground with less damage than a modern knife might show. Surfaces that carry thin films, dark and smooth, instead of the scab of rust. When scientists look at these pieces, their instruments can explain part of the story. They see traces of other elements mixed into the metal, or different structures within it. They can point to soil that drains well, to climates that are kinder to shapes that shed water instead of holding it. Each explanation is reasonable. Yet together they never quite erase the sense that something is out of place. Like a sentence in a book that does not match the paragraphs around it. Perhaps rust is not just a villain, but a patient teacher. It shows us how materials behave when we stop paying attention. If a few ancient objects have resisted its lessons better than most, we are left with two possibilities. Either they were lucky, sheltered by chance from every drop that might have harmed them, or someone long ago learned how to guide iron into a form that gives rust less to hold. To see how strange those survivors are, we have to leave the rules behind and visit them where they stand. Pillars, gates, and tools that should already be ghosts are waiting, their dark surfaces asking questions about what their makers did and why. The first of these survivors does not live in a glass case. It stands outside under an open sky that has changed color 1,000 times. Imagine walking through a busy city, traffic wandering past, haze hanging low, and there, almost ignored beside a temple or courtyard, rises a column of iron. Rain has drummed on it for centuries. Summer heat has pressed against it, winter fog has wrapped it in damp arms. And still, when you step closer, you see no crumbling, no deep wounds, only a dark, continuous surface that seems to have made peace with the air around it. Your fingers almost itch to touch it. The iron looks old, but not tired. The edges are softened by time, yet the body of the pillar remains whole, as if the years have flowed around it rather than through it. The stone at its base is worn by footsteps and weather, but the metal it holds appears calmer than the pavement. You know, without needing a degree, that this is not how the story of iron is supposed to go. Far away, another relic waits behind a gate that still remembers the hands that opened it. Picture-heavy iron bars, twisted and joined before your great-grandparents were born, still swinging on their hinges with a quiet, stubborn grace. Storms have thrown themselves against these bars. Wind has driven dust and salt into every joint. Cities around them have changed names and rulers, but the gate greets each new century the same way, with a slow, unbroken movement that feels almost like a bow. Not all of these survivors are grand. Some are small enough to sit in a palm. A farmer's tool, forgotten in wet ground, lies buried through flood and drought, through the roots of plants rising and dying until someone's spade strikes metal. When it is lifted into the light, people expect to see flakes, holes, the familiar orange scab. Instead, they find a compact, solid shape, its surface dark but strangely intact, as if the earth had been more cradle than grave. Around each of these objects, the environment tells a different part of the same story. Humid air carries moisture to any exposed surface. Acid rain eats at stone and steel. Soot and pollution wrap themselves around monuments, wearing them down grain by grain. Modern bridges need constant care. Street railings peel and blister. Cars left alone in driveways develop freckles of rust after a handful of winters. Yet here stand these older things, made without electricity or stainless formulas, ignoring the schedule of decay that governs so much of our world. Experts approach them with instruments and carefully chosen words, but the basic question is simple enough for anyone standing there in the drizzle or under the sun. How did this survive? Was the ore special, drawn from a vein that no one can find today? Did the smith add some forgotten ingredient, some plant ash, some powder now dismissed as superstition? Or are we looking at the result of long, patient refinement? A recipe polished over generations and then left to stand in the rain as proof. What makes the puzzle deeper is that these relics are not alone. One pillar might be dismissed as a lucky accident of climate. One gate could be explained by a sheltered position or a coating we can no longer see. One tool might have slept in unusually kind soil. But scattered across maps and museums, in villages and cities, are enough examples to turn coincidence into a pattern. When iron stands in the weather for lifetimes and barely flinches, the word primitive starts to sound strangely misplaced. We walk beneath power lines and over steel-reinforced roads, trusting materials that quietly fatigue. We repaint, repair, replace. Behind those routines stands a different vision of metal, one in which a single object can be asked to endure not just decades, but an age. To understand how such a thing was possible, the journey now has to leave the open air and step back into the heat where these immortal pieces were first born. The smoky forges where ore met fire and raw iron took its first breath. To understand how such iron was born, the scene has to shift again, away from weathered pillars and gates, back to a time when metal was not a convenience but a miracle. There is no factory here, no chimney, no conveyor belt. There is a clearing at a village, a furnace of stone and clay, and people moving through the dusk with baskets of broken rock. What they carry does not look like iron. It is dull ore, chipped from hillsides and riverbeds, gathered from places where elders say the earth's blood runs close to the surface. The furnace is already being prepared, its hollow belly packed with charcoal. Someone works the bellows in steady strokes, feeding air into the waiting chamber. The first tongues of flame lick upward, small and uncertain. But this night will be long, and the fire will grow until it consumes hours as easily as wood. As darkness deepens, the work becomes a rhythm. Ore, charcoal, air. The villagers tip their loads into the top of the furnace, layer upon layer, while the blacksmith or smelter watches the color of the glow within. There are no senses here, only eyes that have spent many nights judging the difference between red and white, between not enough and far too much. Impurities burn away, gases slip out through cracks. Deep inside, the rock begins to change into something more malleable, though no one can see it yet. Sometimes, someone adds something extra. A scoop of fine ash from a particular tree, a pinch of glassy sand, powdered fragments of old slag, saved for reasons a written recipe would not bother to explain. To an outsider, these gestures might look like superstition. To those tending the fire, they are memory made physical. My teacher did this. When we skip it, the iron is wrong. Hour follows hour. The village sleeps. The furnace does not. Sparks blow out into the night like fireflies. The air smells of smoke and metallic tang, sharp enough to taste. At last, when the master judges that enough has melted and run together, the furnace is opened. What emerges is not a neat bar, but a spongy, glowing mass heavy as a newborn planet. A bloom of iron, riddled with slag and streaked with uneven carbon. This is where many modern eyes would see only imperfection. The metal is inconsistent, layered with impurities, different from one batch to the next. But in those variations, under hammer and file, lie possibilities. Some blooms will make soft, forgiving iron, easy to work but quick to wear. Others will, by accident or design, hold pockets of material that harden well, take edges and keep them, resist gnawing rust longer than their neighbors. Different valleys, forests, and beliefs all leave their signatures on the iron that emerges. One region favors charcoal from a single tree. Another insists that smelting can only be done on certain days, or under certain stars. Somewhere else, one kind of ore is mixed with another in ratios never spoken aloud. None of this is described in scientific terms. It is carried instead in stories. When we did it this way, the plows lasted. When we did it that way, the axes failed. It is tempting to think of these furnaces as clumsy ancestors of our industrial processes, stumbling toward what we now do predictably. But seen from another angle, they are alive with experiment. Every firing is a test. Over lifetimes, adjustments are made. More air, a different ratio, a longer heat. The bloomeries remain uneven, but they are tuned like instruments to the preferences of those who play them. By the time a rough bar finally leaves this world of song and trial, it already carries the fingerprints of countless choices. The iron is not pure, and perhaps that is the point. Hidden among its flaws may lie the subtle structures and accidental coatings that help certain pieces endure what should have broken them. To see how those possibilities are awakened, we have to follow the metal out of the furnace and onto the anvil, where heat, hammer, and the shock of sudden cooling complete the transformation begun in the fire's heart. When the rough bar leaves the furnace, it is not finished. It is a promise, still soft in places, still threaded with slag, The real shaping begins where the light is close, where iron and intention meet above an anvil. The forge glows again. The smith feeds charcoal into the coals, stirs until the heart of the fire turns a steady orange, then slides the iron into that waiting mouth. Color climbs along the bar, chasing away grey, turning it from dull stone to something that seems to breathe. Heat alone can ruin everything. Too cold, and the metal will crack. Too hot, and its structure will crumble. There is no gauge to warn him, only shifting shades of red and yellow. A change in the way the light moves across the surface tells him when to lift the bar and when to wait. When the moment comes, he draws the iron from the fire and lays it on the anvil. The first strike lands like a decision. Each blow drives out slag, pushes the grains closer, stretches and compresses hidden patterns. The bar lengthens, bends toward the shape it is meant to hold. Sparks fly, brief, bright stars against the dark. All the while the iron cools, color drains with every heartbeat. At a point, the smith stops, returns it to the coals, and waits for the glow to return. Again and again this cycle repeats. Heat, hammer, cool. Heat, hammer, cool. With each round, the structure shifts. Layers form, strains align, weaknesses close. In modern charts, this dance has names. Here, and it lives in the weight of the hammer and the memory in the hands. Eventually, the shape is right, but the story is not over. A blade, a tool, a hinge must do more than look correct. It must endure. For that, the smith turns to the most sudden step of all, the one that will decide whether the iron becomes strong, breaks, or ages in some unusual way. He heats the piece again, watching its color in the dimmed forge. When he is satisfied, he moves not to the anvil, but to a waiting vessel. It might be filled with water, with oil, with brine, or with a mixture whose ingredients no outsider hears named. Whatever it holds, it waits cool and dark, while the iron glows. Then, in a movement so fast it seems to cut time, he plunges the metal into the liquid. The hiss is fierce. Steam leaps upward. For an instant, it is hard to see where iron ends and vapor begins. Inside, atoms scramble to keep up. The sudden loss of heat locks structures in place, hardens some regions, leaves others tough and springy. A thin layer may form on the surface, too slight to see yet strong enough to change how the iron meets air and water. Sometimes the quench goes wrong. A crack sings through the metal. Warping twists the shape. The smith learns from these failures, adjusting heat, timing, or liquid in tiny increments. Over years, these adjustments become instinct. He might never explain them, but he knows to hold the piece in the fire a breath longer on a cold winter day, or stir the oil before he lowers the blade. To those watching, it all looks simple. Heat, hammer, quench, then a tempering to draw back brittleness. Yet, within that simplicity, variations hide. Different fires, angles, depths in the quench all leave fingerprints on the finished piece. Some tools leave the workshop ordinary, bound to rust and fatigue like any other. Others carry within them arrangements that make decay hesitate, just for a while. Every ancient blade that still holds an edge, every hinge that still moves after centuries of rain, may owe its survival to one such choice truly made in a breath and never written down. Were these choices practical, Or did the smith feel that something larger moved with him when he worked? Some unseen partner in the dance of heat and cooling? To follow that question, the path must leave the light of the forge and step into the half-shadow of belief, where fire becomes not just a tool, but a presence. The forge was never just a place to work. In many older worlds, it was where the line between the everyday and the unseen grew thin. Long before anyone spoke of chemistry or metallurgy, people understood one thing very clearly. Ordinary stone should not glow like the sun, and solid iron should not soften like wax. Whatever let that happen had to be treated with care. Picture a village at dawn, long before clocks and sirens. Smoke lifts in thin threads from a single low building. Inside, before any metal is touched, the blacksmith moves slowly through a set of small, deliberate actions. A pinch of grain into the coals, a drop of drink on the floor, a hand resting for a moment on the rough stone of the hearth, as if greeting something older than the village itself. No one writes these gestures down. They are simply how you begin. In another land, the steps are different, but the feeling is the same. The forge is swept in silence. Certain words are avoided, certain jokes unsaid. On some days, no work starts until a candle is lit and left to burn beside the tools. It looks like superstition from the outside. From within, it is rhythm, a way of lining the human heart up with the breathing of the fire. Fire, after all, is not passive. It eats, moves, and changes what it touches. To those who depended on it for metal, it was given offerings like a guest and warnings like a dangerous animal. Children were kept away, not only from the heat, but from the secrets that lived in how the smith spoke to the flames. Outsiders might be allowed to watch briefly, but the most important parts of the work happened after the door was closed. Some guilds turned this private respect into public rule. No member was allowed to share certain techniques with strangers. Oaths were sworn over anvils. A smith who revealed too much could lose his livelihood, or worse. The official reason was often protection of the trade, yet beneath that lay something deeper, a sense that mishandled knowledge could harm, that not everyone should be able to command metal and fire in the same way. Myths followed these precautions like shadows. Stories grew about smiths who chained spirits inside blades, who could bind curses into nails driven into doorways, who knew songs that made armor ring with more than sound. There were tales of fires that refused to burn for the unworthy, and of forges that died when their keeper broke his vows. Even if these stories were exaggerated, they reveal how people felt about the space where awe, will, and heat met. It was not merely a workshop, it was a kind of unmarked temple. Not every ritual changed the metal, some simply kept people careful and focused. But imagine how many small inherited practices might have had quiet physical effects. The exact way a hearth was cleaned, the order in which fuel was added, the pause before a quench. Over decades, these habits could shape the way heat moved, the way smoke flowed, the way a surface met the air. The smiths themselves might have spoken of luck or blessing, while their hands repeated techniques that produced more than they realized. When we stand today before iron that has shrugged off centuries of rain, it is tempting to look only at the visible object. Yet behind each enduring surface, there stands a long chain of almost invisible acts, many of them wrapped in ritual language. If the forge was treated like an altar, perhaps it is because the people who worked there sensed that they were waking something powerful, something that needed rules. And then there are the stories most people prefer not to picture at bedtime. Stories that say the quenching trough sometimes held more than water or oil. Stories that hint the price of a blade that never fails might be written not in ink, but in the things poured into that final hissing bath. In the quiet between hammer blows, whispers claimed that certain mixtures woke a hardness in iron nothing else on earth could ever truly match. When people spoke in low voice about the forge, it was not only the fire they mentioned, it was what went into the water waiting beside it. On most days, the quenching trough held simple things: clean water from a well, oil pressed from seeds or animals, brine made with salt. Yet at the edges of history, in the places where memory frays into legend, other ingredients begin to appear. There are old stories of blades cooled in blood. The details change with the teller. Some say the smith pricked his own arm, letting a small ribbon of red twist into the liquid before the glowing iron plunged in. Others insist on darker scenes, where a sword found its final hardness in something far more violent. Still, they linger, repeating the same uneasy idea, that life itself could be poured into metal. Other whispers are quieter, less dramatic but no less strange. Bones ground into fine powder and mixed into the quench. Pieces of horn, hoof, or hide left to soak for days until the liquid took on a slick, faintly sour feel. Bundles of herbs tied over the trough, dripping resins and oils into the waiting depth. The smell would tell a different story. Modern ears hear these accounts and rush to separate fact from horror. And perhaps much of it was exaggeration or dream. Yet the line between symbol and method is not always clear. In the language of stories, saying a blade was quenched in blood might mean it was hardened in a rich, carbon-bearing mixture whose recipe has been lost. Saying bones were used could be a rough way of describing additions that changed the chemistry of the bath in ways no one could measure. But everyone could feel in the results. There is, after all, a quiet logic behind the unease. Organic matter is full of carbon, fats, and salts. When heated, when burned, when mixed with water and met by hot iron, those elements can cling to the surface, soak into the outer layers, and change how the metal faces the world. A film might form, invisible but real, that slows the first bite of rust. The smith may have spoken of spirits accepting an offering. The metal might simply have been given a subtle shield. Think of a blade glowing orange in the dim forge, its heat almost painful to look at. The smith lifts it with tongs, holds it over a trough that smells of smoke, iron, oil, and something else he does not name. The plunge is sudden. Steam roars. For a moment, the world narrows to sound and scent. In that instant, heat races out of the metal, and whatever is dissolved in the liquid rushes in return, reacting on the skin of the iron at a scale too small for any eye. Did the smith understand this in the way a modern scientist would? Probably not. His words for it would be different. He might say the blade had been fed, or that it had accepted the strength of what was sacrificed to harden it. Yet the result, if the stories hold any truth, was more than ceremony. Some of those blades were said to keep an edge longer, to resist the damp breath of storage rooms and battlefields alike. Of course, not every tale can be trusted. A simple oil quench might become a river of blood in the retelling. A modest addition of bone ash could be inflated into something monstrous to impress or frighten. What matters for our quiet mystery is this: People believed that what they put into the quenching bath mattered deeply, and some were willing to guard those mixtures as fiercely as any treasure. Between the gruesome legend and the measured experiment lies a narrow bridge. And on that bridge stands the rust-resistant blade, holding its secrets in a surface film no one today can quite read. Not all of those secrets, though, are dissolved in liquid. Some are written on the metal itself, in lines and symbols that look like decoration, until you linger on them a little too long. They wait there quietly, like notes from a language we no longer fully remember. If you hold an old blade to the light, the first thing you notice is the edge. But look away from the sharp line for a moment, and another world begins to appear. Tiny grooves running along the length, small stamps near the base, lines that seem almost accidental until you realize how often they repeat. On many ancient tools and weapons, the surface is more than plain metal. Maker's marks sit near the hilt or handle. A simple cross, a small animal, a cluster of lines like a star. Some are bold. Others hide in corners where only another smith or a very patient owner would ever think to look. We are told to think of these as signatures, as early brands. That explanation is neat and likely true in part. A good smith wanted his work recognized just as any craftsperson would. But when you place many of these objects side by side, patterns emerge that feel less like decoration and more like sentences. Certain symbols appear again and again on pieces that share the same kind of finish, or that come from a particular region where the rust seems always a little slower. A spiral here, a trio of dots there, a diagonal slash that never quite changes angle. It is easy to imagine them as quiet codes. This blade quenched in oil. This one forged from a special bloom. This other shaped in a furnace built to a particular design. Then there are the lines that do not look like symbols at all, just faint striations and shadows in the metal. Some come from the hammer, from the direction of each blow. Others belong to the way layers of iron and carbon folded together, leaving watered patterns that flow like frozen smoke. To a casual eye, they are pretty. To someone who has watched metal change under heat, they might read like maps, showing where hardness lies and where softness waits. In some traditions, extra marks were added after the forging was done. Tiny incisions along the spine of a blade, punch marks around a hole, inlays of different metals set into grooves that follow no obvious practical need. People at the time might have spoken of these as charms, protection against harm or misfortune. Yet protection, in a smith's hands, often has two faces, one spiritual, one stubbornly physical. The difficulty for us is that the key to this language was rarely written down. Instructions might have been spoken from master to apprentice, with a gesture toward a mark, meaning more than any sentence. When you see this, you will know the blade was hardened this way. Use that sign only on metal from the northern ore. Without those whispered explanations, we are left with the marks alone, like notes pulled from a book and stripped of their pages. Modern researchers photograph and catalogue these details, but they must guess at many of their meanings. Are we looking at a family emblem, a guild badge, a recipe, or a prayer? The same symbol might be any of these, depending on who used it and when. The temptation is to flatten it into one answer, yet the reality could be tangled. A sign that told fellow smiths how a piece was made, reassured the buyer that it had been blessed, and reminded the maker of a rule he dared not break. What matters for our slow mystery is that the surface of ancient iron often carries more information than we first assume. Somewhere on a blade that has defied rust for centuries, there may be a tiny mark linking it to a particular furnace, a certain quench, a line of teachers now gone. We may never fully decode these traces, but knowing they exist changes how we look. Instead of seeing decoration alone, we begin to see a script written in sparks and pressure, in habits and hopes. The rust-resistant relic becomes not just a puzzle of chemistry, but a message left in strokes of metal against metal. Similar codes might be scattered across other objects, hinting that the knowledge behind them was once wider, deeper, and more truly connected than a single workshop or village. The first time you see such a blade, you might think your eyes are playing tricks. The edge is dark, not bright, and yet it seems to drink in the light and send it sliding along faint, rippling lines. When you tilt it, those lines move like water, disturbed by a slow current, shifting in patterns that never quite repeat. It looks less like something carved from metal and more like a river frozen mid-flow. Legends cling to blades like this. Stories say they could slice a silk scarf dreary drifting through the air, bite through armor where ordinary weapons would shatter, hold a sharpness that turned battlefields into places of whispered awe. But the mystery here is not only about cutting power. When such swords are found centuries later, pulled from dry storerooms or old graves, they often show less decay than cruder iron that shared the same years. Their surfaces seem to have resisted the usual hungry creep of rust. Some of these weapons began as small lumps of steel made far from the lands where the finished swords were eventually wielded. Traders carried them over deserts and seas, dense, carefully prepared cakes of metal born from specific ores and furnaces. The steel inside them had grown under slow, patient heating and cooling, as if the fire had been asked not just to melt, but to think. Only when those cakes reached skilled hands were they stretched, folded, and shaped into blades that seemed almost alive. Inside, under the surface you can touch, tiny structures formed, bands of harder and softer material wove together. A repeating dance invisible without magnification. The outward ripples, the water-like waves people admired, were simply the visible trace of this hidden weaving. Where one strip met another, where carbon gathered or thinned, the steel changed how it met the world. Some regions took rust more slowly. Others hardened in ways that helped the blade flex and recover instead of snapping. Modern laboratories have peered into these metals and found clues. Traces of certain elements, distinctive arrangements of carbides, patterns that match specific heating cycles. We can describe them, name them, even imitate parts of them in controlled experiments. Yet the full recipe, ore, furnace shape, airflow, timing, the touch of the smith's hand, was never written down in one place. It lived in roots now broken, in workshops now silent. When trade shifted, when wars redirected caravans, when the last keepers of those furnaces died or moved to different work, much of the path that fed these blades simply vanished. Steel of that quality became harder to find. The few pieces left behind turned into treasures, then curiosities, then puzzles. We still marvel at their patterns and sometimes manage to create similar ones. But the sense remains that something about the original practice has not fully returned. It is tempting to think of these swords only as weapons, born to wound. Yet, they are also records. Every wave in the surface, every region that shrugs off rust a little longer than expected carries information about a chain of decisions made long ago. Which ore to dig? How hot to run the furnace? How long to let the steel cool before touching it again? Each choice left its fingerprint in the way the blade endures. In a museum or a private collection, under soft light, such a sword lies still. But if you look closely, you might feel that it has not entirely stopped moving. The patterns seem to shift as your angle changes, as if the metal is remembering heat and pressure, remembering the hands that guided it. If visible lines can hold such a story, what unseen patterns lie beneath them, quietly guarding the blade against time itself? They lack the famous ripples and the silk-slicing tails, but they faced storms, salt, and ice with the same quiet defiance. To follow the trail of lost metallurgies, the journey now has to leave these shimmering blades behind and travel north, where iron met the sea wind and refused to bow strangely unchanged. The north does not welcome the careless. Here, iron is asked to endure more than sharpness. It must survive landscapes that try to break everything they touch. Imagine longships riding grey waves, their wooden ribs flexing, their iron nails and rivets holding fast, while salt spray lashes them day after day. The metal disappears beneath tar and planks, unseen, yet its quiet strength decides who returns and who does not. In coastal villages, blacksmiths work within earshot of the sea. Their forges burn while gulls cry and wind rattles loose shutters. The tools that leave these places are not meant to dazzle, but to last. An axe used to fell trees for ships might be passed from parent to child. Its edge refreshed, its body still sound, despite winters of damp and hard labor. Somewhere on its surface, small differences in forging and structure quietly slow the rust that would have eaten a weaker tool. Further inland, across forests and frozen rivers, warriors carry blades whose stories smell of pine and snow. Some swords are built from twisted rods of different iron and steel, welded together like braided rope. The pattern that appears when they are polished is not as fluid as southern water steels, but it speaks of layering all the same. Hard and soft lie side by side, each taking some of the strain, each protecting the other. On open steppe, where riders cover vast distances under a sky that never seems to end, metal must match the pace of horses. Bits, stirrups, and fittings face sweat, dust, and sudden rain. A broken ring or weakened buckle here means more than inconvenience. It can mean death. Smiths who serve these riders learn, through trial and sometimes tragedy, what forms, thicknesses, and combinations endure. Their knowledge does not arrive in books. It arrives when something fails and is remade better. High in the mountains, iron endures a different trial. Temperature swings crack rock and test every joint in a roof. Snow melts and refreezes along nails and hooks. In such places, a single failed hinge might trap people inside during a storm. So the village smith adjusts the way he layers his metals, the way he shapes and cools them, until the pieces stop betraying him. Over time, his methods look unremarkable from the outside, yet the iron he turns out seems stubbornly unwilling to give in. Modern eyes often see only the roughness. The surfaces are not mirror bright. The lines are not perfectly straight, too. Yet when archaeologists uncover these northern pieces, rivets from shipwrecks, fragments of mail, tools abandoned in bogs, they sometimes find that the core has held far better than expected. Beneath flaking outer layers, the inner metal can remain tough and coherent, as if the structure itself has been arranged to sacrifice some parts so that others stay strong. None of this requires mystical explanation. Layered construction, careful choice of materials, and repeated folding all influence how iron faces water and stress. However, the people who refined these techniques were guided not by diagrams, but by experience gathered in harsh conditions, where failure was remembered in funerals and rebuilding. Desperation has a way of sharpening observation. A smith who sees which rivets fail in storms will change the way he makes the next batch, even if he never explains why his hands move differently. When we compare these rugged northern creations to sleek modern steels produced in controlled factories, we might assume that the newer must always be superior. Yet some of our perfect-looking alloys pit and crumble quickly when coatings wear away, while these older layered pieces stubbornly hold together. Strength, it seems, is not only a matter of composition, but of how that composition is arranged in space. The blades and fittings of the North rarely enjoy the fame of silken test-tails, yet they too belong to the map of lost metallurgies. Their story suggests that when people must rely on the same iron through storm after storm, refining it piece by piece, they can discover arrangements that later ages admire without quite understanding. From these open coasts and cold heights, the trail bends inward again, toward cloistered courtyards where the hammer rang behind monastery walls and the work of metal was guarded with prayers as well as rules. If the coasts and islands taught metal to survive in the open, monasteries and temples taught it to endure in silence. Behind thick walls, away from markets and battlefields, iron and bronze were drawn into a different kind of life. They did not only cut or pierce, they rang, framed, and turned with the rhythm of a prayer. Imagine a monastery perched on a hillside, its stone darkened by centuries of rain. Winds scrape along the towers, winters press snow into hidden corners, summers bake the roofs until the air shimmers. From one high opening hangs a bell, heavy and still until a rope is pulled. It has sung through storms that toppled trees and through seasons that forgot the names of their own rulers. Yet its skin carries fewer wounds than the lampposts along the road below. Somewhere within that same complex, there was once a small forge that served only the brothers who lived there. Its fire did not glow for kings or merchants, only for hinges, locks, tools, and the occasional repair to sacred vessels. The man who worked there might also have copied manuscripts or tended gardens. His reputation did not travel, but his metal had to work every single day. A gate that jammed in winter, or a cracked chisel would interrupt more than comfort. It would disturb the careful flow of communal life. In such places, time moved in circles. Days were marked by bells calling to prayer, and work in repeating patterns. Metalwork slid into those patterns as well. Bars of iron were bought or smelted, set aside, and used bit by bit. When something failed, it was remade, not with haste, but with attention. A little more care at the fire this time. A slightly longer rest in the embers. A new way of cleaning the surface before it met the air. Rules wrapped themselves around these actions. Some tasks began only after a certain psalm was sung, or on specific days of the week. Some workshops were kept quiet. Argument and coarse talk were forbidden near the hearth. From one angle, these customs look purely spiritual. From another, they are a kind of discipline that slows the worker down, keeping the same steps in the same order, until small improvements can be noticed and kept. Written instructions, when they appear at all, are brief. A margin note might say, "Do as is customary in this house," and leave everything else unsaid. The rest lived in memory and imitation. A novice watched an older brother turn a key, feel a hinge, judge the color of iron in the coals. "Like this," the elder would say, and the lesson passed on. Temple complexes in other lands followed their own rituals, yet shared this fusion of devotion and craft. Metal workers casting bells, lamps, or statues might fast before work or keep the workshop ritually clean. Whatever the belief behind it, the effect was the same. Work slowed, steps stayed in order, and attention settled on details hurried hands would miss. Walk through such places today, and you can see what that attention achieved. Paint peels, wood splits, fabrics turn to dust, but a bell still rings when pulled. A centuries-old door still answers to its key. The metal has not escaped rust, yet it has resisted it with a calm that feels out of proportion to the world that made it. Not every monk or temple smith was a hidden master. Mistakes were made and some techniques vanished. Still, the conditions for refinement were there. Time, repetition, and a belief that even a latch or nail could be part of something holy. Tiny advantages in alloy heat and handling could add up until an object hanging in a tower or resting on an altar carried an expertise no single name could claim. When modern researchers test these bells, locks, or fittings and find them unusually resilient, they may be touching the last echo of those experiments. Somewhere inside the metal, the rhythm of those days remains. Work done slowly, under watchful eyes, guarded not by markets but by vows. From warships and cold shores, the path of lost metallurgies has led us here, into cloisters and sanctuaries before it turns toward bright laboratories and puzzled minds. The lab hums like a quiet hive, and the blade rests beneath glass as if it were sleeping. A technician lowers a lens. Light floods the iron's dark skin, and the image on the monitor blooms into a landscape. At this scale, scratches turn into valleys, a faint sheen into a weather system. The team expects to read a familiar story. Corrosion layered like sediment, oxides building outward in crumbling tears, impurities gathered like wreckage along a shore. Instead, the surface looks organized, almost deliberate. A thin, dark film lies over the metal like lacquer, continuous where time should have chewed holes. Within it, tiny zones repeat, not perfectly, but with the rhythm of something grown rather than smeared. They switch tools. A spectrometer separates the surface into notes of a song. Iron, yes. Carbon, yes. Traces of silicon jars. Phosphorus. Perhaps a breath of chromium or vanadium scarcely above a whisper. The numbers are small, but they arrange themselves strangely, concentrated in threads rather than scattered. One researcher frowns, tilts her head, and asks for a scan at a different angle. The second pass confirms the first. A map of minute regions, each with its own temperament, stitched together without obvious seams. Under higher magnification, the metal becomes a forest. Needles rise. Plates lie flat. Filigree spreads like frost on a window. Textbooks have names for these shapes, convolutes and confident labels paired with neat temperatures. The room does not feel confident. No one doubts what carbides and oxides are, or how they normally grow. What puzzles the group is how tidy the boundaries appear, how thin and continuous the outer film remains, as if decades of damp had trained it rather than torn it. Explanations line up like samples on a tray. Perhaps the ore carried friendly elements in just the right proportions. Perhaps the burial drained water away. Perhaps smoke, oil, or ash left a residue that matured into protection over a century of sleep. Each answer tastes reasonable, and each leaves an aftertaste. Why do neighboring pieces, made near the same hills and handled by similar hands, surrender so quickly? A speck is ground from a hidden edge and fed to a thermal analyzer. Heat climbs and falls. The sample stiffens and relaxes. The curves behave politely, but not predictably, like a choir keeping time without a conductor. The senior scientist leans back, fingers steepled, and smiles in that way experts do when certainty thins. "It isn't magic," he murmurs. "It's something precise we don't yet measure." Paperwork grows. Images gain scale bars. Spectra sprout circles. Drafts gather cautious phrases. The conclusions will say that composition, environment, and process together likely produce the unusual stability. They will not claim a miracle. They will not claim a single lost trick. Between those sentences, however, sits a quiet admission. Instruments can resolve the small, but they cannot capture a hand pausing half a heartbeat longer at the fire, or a habit repeated for reasons no one remembers. Someone brings in a control blade, modern and clean. Under the microscope, it looks honest, practical, a field of tidy grains bounded by predictable scars. Exposed to a mist chamber, it grows the usual orange bloom in the usual places. Set beside the ancient surface, the contrast feels like the difference between a paved road and a path worn by feet that knew where they were going. Night gathers outside the windows. The lamp reflections drift across the glass case. The blade returns to its cradle. The monitors fade, but the questions refuse to dim. Why does the film hold together? How did tiny structures arrange themselves with such discipline? What combination of customs, ores, and accidents trained this iron to grow old so gracefully? The instruments have done their work faithfully, and in doing so they have illuminated a different ignorance, the kind hiding in assumptions about how metal should behave when left alone with time. In the morning, the lab will set up comparisons. Modern nails, tools, and coupons will line the benches. If the strangeness survives the contrast, the inquiry will step outside, into rain and salt and years, to watch iron keep its poise beside the metal we trust every day. Set two pieces of metal side by side on a table. One is old iron, dark and calm, cut from a hinge that outlived its door. The other is new steel, bright and exact, stamped last year in a factory. At first glance, the contest seems unfair. The modern piece carries certificates and specifications. The old one carries scars and rumors. Yet the test that matters is patient. Air, water, time. Engineers spray a salt mist across both. Beads form. Droplets creep. Protective coatings on the new steel do their duty until a scratch, thin as a hair, opens a path. Rust blooms along the cut like lichen. The old iron, unpainted, grows a dark film that thickens slowly and stops, as if the surface knew where to hold its line. No miracle, perhaps. Just a behavior that refuses to be rushed. Moved to heat and cold. run them through cycles that mimic spring mornings and winter nights. The new piece expands and contracts obediently, but where two parts meet a seam appears, small at first, inviting moisture. The old hinge, forged from layered metal, shows stress along a sacrificial skin while the interior stays sound. It is not stronger in every way, only arranged to fail where failure hurts least. Modern steel is a marvel. It spans rivers, climbs as towers, and bends into shapes ancient hands could never pull from a fire. Alloys tailored for turbines, for scalpels, for engines prove what industry can do when speed meets science. But speed has its own gravity. Factories reward output, suppliers reward cost, and designs reward predictability. Processes that take too long, resting metal in ashes, adjusting heat, quenching in mixtures that require days of preparation, fall away because the calendar will not make room. In case studies, the contrast becomes personal. A century-old gate survives in a coastal town where new railings flake by their third season. Hand tools retrieved from wet soil clean up and return to work, while cheaper replacements stain and seize after a single winter. Ship rivets hammered by men who judged color with eyes outlast plates cut by machines. Not because the machines were wrong, but because layered, forgiving structures can absorb insults that precision cannot. None of this makes the past superior. Many old objects failed quickly, vanished without notice, or rusted to memory. What remains are the winners of a long, merciless selection. We compare them to average present-day pieces and draw conclusions that need caution. Even so, the pattern pricks. Where modern parts depend on coatings to survive, the removal of paint or zinc reveals a vulnerability to rain. Where older iron built its defense into the metal's own arrangement, damage tends to slow rather than cascade. Ask a metallurgist why, and the answers are practical. Controlled impurities form stable films. Layered construction interrupts cracks. Low, even working heats prevent large internal stresses. The phrases are sane. What lingers is not doubt of the facts, but a suspicion about priorities. If we priced patience into our schedules, would our materials age differently? Stand under a bridge and listen to the traffic pass overhead. The girders are heroic, the bolts enormous, the paint fresh where crews have worked. You trust it, and you should. Yet imagine the same span in 50 years. Its coatings nicked, its drains clogged, its edges left bare for one harsh season too many. Will the bones beneath still hold their discipline? Or will rust travel quick roads opened by haste? Old iron is not a rebuke. It is a reminder. When a hinge swings after storms that erase the hand that made it, it suggests a different relationship with time. Work paced to the rhythm of seasons can fold durability into the material itself. Our age builds faster and higher, and that is its genius. But in the quiet between projects, beside a gate that should have failed, a question waits. If longevity is the goal, what have we traded away to arrive here so quickly? To look for that cost, we have to separate what we understand from the parts that still refuse to obey. The remainder that keeps raising its hand in the back of every lab. Begin with what the instruments can explain. Some ancient irons owe their calm aging to helpful trace elements folded into the metal at birth. A vein of ore brings a little phosphorus, a little silicon, just enough to change how the first layer of rust forms. Instead of flaking, it compacts into a tight skin that slows the next wave. In other cases, Burial in well-drained soil, shelter from salt, or decades of dryness gave the metal an easier life than most. Add to this the effects of smoke, oil, and ash that drifted across surfaces in workshops where fires never slept, and a part of the puzzle takes shape. Taken together, these factors make sense. They are not supernatural. They simply tilt the game in iron's favor. Add process to composition. Lower, steadier, forging heats reduce internal stress and keep grains smaller. Layered construction spreads strain and interrupts cracks, turning damage into a slow whisper instead of a shout. Quenching in oil or brine, sometimes enriched with organic matter, can leave a film that behaves like a varnish the eye cannot see. Tempering after the quench draws out brittleness without erasing strength. Every step has a physical story, testable and repeatable in parts. Now move to what refuses to sit down neatly. Some relics with near twins in composition still age differently. Replicas made with careful attention, matching reported trace elements, mimicking furnace shapes, copying quench recipes, sometimes miss the mark by a hair that becomes a canyon over decades. The final surface film is thinner, or more patchy. The inner structure looks right, but feels wrong in how it responds to humidity and heat. Asked to explain the difference, even confident researchers reach for phrases like timing, technique, and operator effect, polite ways of pointing at choices too fine for a paragraph. Perhaps that is where the missing pieces live, in pauses and habits. A master holds the blade in the coals 3 heartbeats longer on winter nights. He stirs oil before the quench, because his teacher did. He files a surface in one direction only, opening tiny grooves that help a film grow uniform. None of these show up in a chemical analysis. All of them can sway the outcome when time does the measuring. It does not help that history erased much of the commentary. Workshops burned, apprentices died before they became masters. Guilds nudged knowledge into riddles to keep it inside their doors. Even where notes survives they speak in shorthand, do as is customary. Use the good ash, cool as taught. We are left to bridge from results back to reasons, and bridges built in reverse rarely carry the whole weight. There is also a bias we carry without noticing. We want a single trick, a powder, a plant, a number on a thermometer. Research rarely rewards that hunger. Most of the time, endurance grows from a network of small factors cooperating. Composition, heat, order of steps, and the temperament of the person in charge. Isolated, each looks modest. Braided, they become something we cannot quite name. None of this requires romance. It asks for patience. When experiments fail to match the most resilient artifacts, the lesson may be less about the limits of science and more about the limits of rushed replication. A week in a modern lab can build a blade that looks the part. A generation of practice can build one that ages with unnerving grace. Difference in outcome, difference in pace. So we hold 2 truths at once. The strange longevity of certain ancient irons can be explained mostly by natural causes and good technique. Yet a remainder persists, a small percentage that refuses to line up with our tidy models. That remainder is not a doorway to fantasy. It is a signpost pointing toward the things a culture can lose when its lineages break. Not knowledge of what, but knowledge of when and how guarded in muscle memory and ritual. We need to look harder longer. To follow that sign, we have to leave the bench and walk back into history, where those lineages were severed by fire, war, and forgetfulness. and the quiet pages that might have finished the story turn to smoke. Smoke is the oldest editor of history. It rises from cities as easily as from a hearth, and whenever it lifts, something vanishes. Workshops go first, roofs broken by stones, benches overturned, quenching troughs kicked into ash. Anvils cool in the dark while streets fill with shouting and the quiet after. The emptiness where a rhythm used to be. Bellows hammer, water breath, erased by a single night of heat. Libraries follow. Not only the great halls with columns and catalogues, but the small rooms above shops where masters kept notebooks streaked with soot. A page reads, "Hold at low red until the skin glows evenly. Quench in the brew of last winter." Another shows a furnace mouth with dots where the clay should be pierced for air. None of it feels dramatic until a spark finds dry paper. Shelves become ladders for fire to climb. War does not ask which book holds a city's memory. It tramples ledger and legend alike. Oaths sworn inside blow into the street. Apprentices scatter, press their palms to the walls they meant to learn within, and run. The line of instruction thins the way, wire thins when it is overdrawn. Stretched, weakened, one more pull from breaking. Sometimes the losses are not loud. A roof leaks where no one looks. Insects nest inside a chest of papers. A master grows old, tells himself there will be time to dictate the last steps, and then does not wake. His apprentice, competent but unsure, carries the routine forward without the tiny corrections that turned good into remarkable. The shop continues. The edge is decent. The iron still hardens. Yet, the blade that might have aged strangely well is never born, because the breath-length pause before the quench died with one man's habit. We treat erased knowledge as if it were a locked door waiting for a key. More often it is a staircase that simply ends. One city falls, another rises. Roads bend, trade shifts. A pilgrimage route that carried rare charcoal turns into a guarded border. Recipes depend on people who depend on places, and when places are rearranged, formulas unravel without anyone tearing them. Imagine a single scroll that could spare us decades of guessing. The script is tidy, the instructions plain. Stir oil with ash from vine cuttings, add bone scraped thin. Wait 3 nights before use. Now picture that scroll curling in the heat of a city-wide fire, lifting like a lit leaf, then becoming one more weightless black flake among thousands. Centuries later, a blade is lifted from the ground and behaves as if the scroll still existed. We call it mysterious because the paper is gone. Not all erasure comes from accident. Some is deliberate and righteous in its hour. Edicts burn superstition to purify doctrine. With the punishment of one teacher, a branch of practice is pruned so sharply it does not sprout again. We inherit the silence and call it mystery, forgetting the hands that created it. Walk the ruins of a foundry, and you will see that loss is not theatrical. It is quiet. A brick fallen here, a channel filled there. The plan of the place becomes a riddle. Stand long enough and you can almost hear the missing steps. A shutter lifted to draw a crosswind, a ladle tipped at a certain angle. They are small actions, but they were once the path through a forest. Cut the path and trees close in. If one forgotten page could unlock why certain iron grew old so gently, how many such pages turned to ash while no one watched? We call the remainder miraculous because it survived. In truth, it is merely the part of the song that escaped the fire. The next verses were sung often, but the air grew too hot to hold them. When the echoes fade, go listening in rubble for any fragment of the tune. The urge to control what survives has its own history, and it rarely stops at the edge of war. From here, the road leaves the ruins and climbs toward chambers where decisions were carved in law. Who may touch the fire, who may learn the steps, and how silence could be bound to an oath. They said iron could raise a village or topple a throne, and rulers heard the second half louder. Where metal becomes weapon, the hand that shapes it draws attention from those who fear waking crowds. Edicts arrive first as polite letters, then as laws. Only licensed forgers may work within the bells. Only sworn members may sell blades. Only approved designs may be taught. Guilds, too, learn to guard their borders. What began as protection of quality hardens into protection of power. Oaths are taken over anvils. Never teach an outsider. Never write the full recipe. Pass the quench only to one who has stood the tests. Fines strip a life's savings. A smith who breaks the silence finds himself without customers, then without fuel, then without a future. The reasons are not always wicked. A village afraid of raiders wants control over who can make spearheads overnight. A temple fears tools made in its name being turned to revolt. A crown worries that the same furnace that pours bells might pour cannon. Knowledge adapts by hiding. A technique keeps its shape, but changes its name. The steps are broken into pieces, so no single worker holds the whole. An apprentice is told only how to tend the fire. A journeyman learns to forge the bar. The master alone performs the quench behind a closed door. Inside, the map has been cut into islands, each with a different keeper. Time works with the gatekeepers. Children repeat words they no longer understand. Do not speak of the oil. Use the good ash. Never turn the blade edge north on the third day. Ritual remains while reason's thin. When the last master who remembers the why is gone, rules still walk the shop like ghosts. Tugging practice along without the thread that once tied everything together. Sometimes the control is sharper. Certain ores are declared property of the crown. The smith is forced to buy fuel from a single yard, metal from a single dealer, an answer to a clerk who has never burned his hands. Small choices vanish. Without them, outcomes drift. The work still functions, but the stray excellence that once appeared like a star on a winter night grows rare. Then come the moments when fear of rebellion becomes policy. Armories are centralized. Village forges may mend but not make. A region that once exchanged techniques at fairs learns to keep its eyes low and its anvil quiet. Knowledge that cannot flow stagnates. Knowledge that stagnates settles and hardens. Knowledge that hardens eventually cracks. Secrecy also travels sideways in markets and barracks. A soldier pays extra for a blade that holds an edge in rain. The smith who sold it accepts coin and keeps quiet. A merchant hears of a furnace that runs cooler and lasts longer. He repeats the rumor, but not the location. Thus whispers become walls, and walls shape the path of skill slowly. Look closely at a surviving relic, and you may see fingerprints of these pressures. A mark that used to announce a method becomes an emblem that announces loyalty. A symbol once meant for fellow smiths is repurposed as a stamp for inspectors. The original meaning shrinks, like a river cut by dams into still pools. Between them, fish adapt or die. Within guilds, jealousy knots with pride. A master keeps a small advantage because it keeps his bench knytselunten. He tells himself he protects the craft from fools. When he leaves, he takes a narrow piece of the path with him, and the road grows that much harder to find. If certain tricks could tip the balance of power, how far would authority go to bury them, or to hoard them under lock and seal? The answer is written not in proclamations but in absences, in gaps where a method should be, in workshops that show signs of work no one admits to doing. Control writes its history on paper. The forge writes its resistance in heat. Yet the heat cools, and paper outlives memory. By the time the locks rust, the habits they enforced remain, and people call the fragments mystery. To see what happened next, follow the sound of machinery replacing footsteps and schedules replacing seasons, where regulation gave way to speed and a different kind of forgetting began. The machines arrive with promises stitched to their belts. They would make more of everything, faster, cleaner, safer. And for a while the promises felt true. Forges that once breathed like animals were replaced by furnaces that roared on schedule. The anvil's patient rhythm gave way to the ticking of clocks. Metal still glowed, but it moved along rails and rollers, through baths measured by dials, into forms demanded by drawings copied 1,000 times. What vanished first was nuance at the fire, and choice itself. Standardization saved lives. Interchangeable parts kept ships at sea and trains on rails. A bolt from one town fit a plate from another without argument. Yet order carries a shadow. What does not fit the schedule is politely asked to leave. Small, fussy steps began to disappear. Resting metal in warm ashes overnight, just to settle its temper. Listening for the moment when the hammer's note changed, then stopping even if the plan called for 2 more blows. These were not written rules, they were attitudes. The new world could not find a column for them on the form. Economies of scale encouraged minimums that worked everywhere, rather than optimals that sang in one place. A furnace set to a number that produced acceptable results across many alloys slowly replaced the careful eye that watched color shift in a single heat. The product did its duty, but the stray excellence that appeared in slower rooms visited less often. Meanwhile, the language changed. A master once said, "Keep it at low red until the skin breathes evenly." The manual now says, "Hold at 700 degrees for 15 minutes. The new sentence is clear, portable, and easy to teach. It is also thin. It carries the temperature, but not the weather, the draft in the doorway, the mood of the fuel, the way winter asks for patience. In laboratories, brilliant people pushed metals to miracles. Alloy emerged that laughed at heat, sprinted inside engines, and sharpened to razors that could split hairs. But these triumphs lived far from the village forge. Where research thrived, routine production hardened. Consider a bridge built with parts that will last exactly as long as the maintenance schedule predicts, provided paint is renewed and drains stay clear. Yet, remove the paint for a season, let one drain clog with leaves, and corrosion begins traveling along paths opened by haste. Ancient irons, arranged to fail gently, might have forgiven the lapse. The new steel takes offense. None of this is villainy. It is the logic of growth. When a process that takes days can be done in hours, a culture learns to measure quality by speed. Attention becomes a cost center. The last person who remembers why the old shop let bars cool in the corner for a day retires. And the practice ends, not with a decision, but with a shrug. We keep what we can measure. We forget what we cannot easily name. Even when a plant manager senses that a small, unmeasured step once mattered, he cannot defend it in the meeting. The word that wins is efficiency. The calendar nods. The door closes. Then a curator lifts a blade from a drawer and notices that the surface has aged like a wall of river stone, slow and calm. A researcher compares samples and finds that the old iron holds a film the new one cannot grow without help. People call the artifact strange. In truth, it is the present that is strange. A world so fast it misplaced its own patience. What if our greatest loss was not a formula, but the willingness to spend decades perfecting how one town cools one bar of iron? Progress was real and remains real, but in the noise of its engines, a softer knowledge fell below hearing. Knowledge that teaches materials to age with grace, not just to perform at peak. To look for it, we must slow down, long enough to notice when the metal itself seems to request a breath. From here, the path leaves the factory floor and turns towards speculation and myth, where erased pages and broken lineages might hide a wider story than we dared to imagine. The question arrives softly, as many important ones do. Did they know more than we think? Not equations on a board, not numbers on a screen, but a slower intelligence grown from heat, habit, and the long patience of hands. Imagine a life arranged around a single circle. Gather fuel, wake the fire, watch the color rise, listen, strike, cool, repeat. Do this for 40 winters, and your body becomes an instrument tuned to changes a meter cannot hear. We are trained to think in steps, but the old work breathed in waves. Moon high, wind from the north, rain predicted by a smell in the yard. Factors' manuals file as noise. Still mattered when nails shattered or plows cracked. A smith might say, "Not on this wind," or "Wait until the moon thins." And an apprentice would remember the rule long after the reason blurred. To us, it reads as folklore. To them, it was survival written in weather. Consider how a violinist hears wood age. On the first day, the sound is fine. 10 years later, the same hands draw out colors that were not there before because the ear has learned to stand still inside the note. So with iron, a master could hold a bar to the light and feel the moment the core, not just the skin, was ready for the hammer. He would talk about glow and touch, not degrees, and he would be right. Generational tuning compounds these instincts. One house learns that wood from the South Grove burns steadier. Another swears by ash from vine cuttings. A third discovers that quenching oil stirred with a willow switch gathers a slick comfort on its surface. Alone, each detail is a story. Together, they form a system invisible to anyone hunting one decisive secret. We inherit fragments as legends about best days and forbidden winds. There is also the attention that grows in silence. Think of the long nights when work continued after the village slept. The door stayed cracked to feel the weather. Tools were placed in the same positions, not for tidiness, but so the hand landed true without looking. From safety grows precision, and from precision, a kind of knowledge that does not need language to remain exact. Our senses capture what we ask for. Numbers for composition, maps of grains, graphs of hardness rising and falling. They do not measure a breath delayed on purpose, or a pause learned after 100 small disasters. If a process depends on cues too fine for writing, sound more than pitch, light more than color, Our record will always be thinner than the act. We will repeat the ingredients and miss the timing by a heartbeat, and the result will behave nearly, but not quite, the same. Did some groups reach a level of attuned practice that makes their metal look uncanny now? It would be stranger if none did. Every landscape teaches different lessons. Salt coasts require forgiving joins. Cold valleys teach slow heat. Temples teach order. War teaches speed under control. Where those lessons were followed without interruption for centuries, outcomes would drift toward a quiet perfection formula alone cannot summon. This is not a call to worship the past. Many blades failed. Many rules were nonsense, yet the persistence of a few exceptional pieces suggests that certain lineages found a groove so deep the work almost guided itself. Stand beside such a forge and you might feel it. The calm, the absence of hurry, the way decisions land as softly as ash. He is not guessing. He is listening to something that does not speak in words. If you spent your life watching metal change color in a fire, what would you notice that we still miss? Perhaps this. That matter, like people, reveals itself to those who wait. And perhaps the old makers, by waiting differently, coaxed iron into arrangements that settle into age like stones in a riverbed. From there, it is a short step to wonder whether their discipline belonged to larger stories. Tales of golden ages and falls, echoes still ringing in steel. Maybe we have mistaken cumulative observation for myth and labeled patience as mystery because it leaves no equation behind today. Stories about metal rarely travel alone. They move inside larger stories about the world. Many traditions speak in ages. A time of gold, a time of silver, a time of bronze. Then the time of iron, when everything grows heavier and harder. The pattern repeats across distant languages, as if people remembered history not as a straight road, but as a circle that sometimes sinks into shadow. Within those cycles appears a recurring image. Objects that refuse to behave like the era that birthed them. Blades said to stay bright. Armor that laughs at rain. Tools that do not dull. The details change. The feeling remains. Someone, once, made metal that would not obey time. Disaster walks beside those memories. Floods and fires swallow cities in a single season. Islands shudder, then slip beneath the sea. After such endings, survivors speak of losses the way you speak of a person. The city that knew, the library that held up the sky, the bell whose note eased grief. Archaeology confirms catastrophe in charcoal and mud. Languages carry craft in riddles and names. Between them lives a possibility that certain practices rose so high that when their keepers vanished, what remained could not stand alone, and the record turned into song. Consider the phrase, God forged. To our ears, it sounds like boast or fantasy. To an older maker, it could have meant a covenant with place and time, or taken only from one hill, smelted with wood, cut on a particular moon, quenched in a mixture aged exactly one season. The practice would be tuned to a calendar and a landscape. Break the covenant, move the shop, rush the waiting, and the result returns to ordinary metal that rusts with the rest. When the instrument that played the melody disappears, the tale keeps the tune alive. Other stories send knowledge walking. A stranger arrives with a sword that never bends. A guest teaches a village to cast bells that never crack. Skill often moves on feet, not paper. One master following a caravan route can carry a technique through deserts and over passes until a border closes and the line goes dark. Centuries later, scholars argue about origins while the object explains nothing, simply enduring under glass. There are reset years too, winters that lasted too long, summers that failed, ash-dark skies turning noon into evening. In such seasons, hunger turns tools into trade, books into fire, craftsmen into soldiers. When the sun returns, people rebuild with what they can remember. What they cannot becomes legend. And legends keep shapes long after meanings evaporate. The blade that never rusted may point to a once common practice, now broken into charms and taboos, stripped of timing, stripped of place. None of this demands a hidden continent of shining towers. It asks only that we treat human peaks seriously. Skill can rise high in small places. A valley, a court, a monastery, a shipyard. Each can become a world where patience is spent like gold. In those worlds, metal may receive more attention than kings. The results look enchanted to later ages because ours forgets how much time certain graces cost. Memory itself has a bias. People repeat the astonishing and forget the ordinary. If one bell truly survived 1,000 winters, 100 that cracked sooner slip from the story, trimming the curve's long tail. Even with that bias, enough survivals remain to feel like a pattern rather than a wish. We meet too many objects that age with grace to blame them all on luck. So lean closer to myth with humility. Names and borders shift. Themes persist. Ages rise and fall. Knowledge concentrates and leaks. A stranger teaches, a law forbids, a fire devours, a craft returns in a new tongue carrying the old shape in its hands. Somewhere in those recurrences live the blades that seem sworn to time rather than threatened by it. Think of a sword laid across an altar in a poem, impervious to rain. It might be fancy. It might also be a memory of a quench whose recipe drifted. Think of a hero's spear, said to find the heart on its own. That could be theatre. Or it could be the habit of balancing shafts and points so precisely that the weapon flew truer than most throws. Language exaggerates, craft endures beneath it. If myths about eternal weapons and God-forged armor hint at real techniques, then museums and dig sites are not merely warehouses of matter. They are choirs of witnesses humming under their breath. Each piece sings a little of the age that made it. What the fires ate, how patient the hands were, which promises were kept. Listening does not prove a vanished empire. It shows how skill concentrates like salt when water evaporates. Leaving flavor on iron we still taste as uncorrupted. And with that taste in our mouths, the camera returns from legend to lamplight, where present-day hands try to coax the same song from new fire. At night, in garages and sheds and narrow rooms behind houses, forge awake like old stars. A small blower replaces bellows, a phone records the glow, a notebook waits for numbers and guesses. These are the new seekers, blacksmiths, bladesmiths, experimental archaeologists, and stubborn hobbyists with a quiet question. If ancients made iron that aged like riverstone, how far can we follow their footprints with what we have now? The workshops look improvised and careful at once. Bricks stacked into a little bloomery, fed with charcoal from a metal drum. Ore from a creek bed, roasted to drive off damp. On the bench, quench jars line up to keep track. Water, oil, brine, oil with ash, oil with bone. Someone runs a heat by color because the thermometer died. Someone else watches numbers. because color lies to his eyes. Both report what happens. The steel stiffens or warps. A dark skin forms or it flakes. A blade rusts overnight or stays clean for a week in weather that usually eats tools. By morning, replies arrive from far away. Try stirring first. Let it rest in warm sand. Lower heat with high phosphorus ore. There are failures, and the videos show them. A quench takes a blade with a sharp hiss and returns it twisted. A bloom falls apart under the hammer because slag hid in the heart. A month of careful runs ends with pieces that look right and behave wrong. The point is not performance on demand. The point is understanding. One change at a time. One variable still while another moves. The patience is familiar, even if the tools are new. Some seekers work close to history. They copy furnace walls from fragments, stack charcoal and ore in the pattern a monk once sketched, and keep the same pace of air for a whole night because the old note said low. Others mix past and present. A high-speed camera watches the quench for the moment a vapor blanket breaks. A microscope checks whether the surface film looks tight or patchy. Sometimes results make the room go quiet. A bar from a crude furnace shows a fine, even structure after forging at lower heats than expected. A blade quenched in oil enriched with bone powder grows a thin, glossy darkness that stays smooth after a week of damp. A hinge made from layered scraps resists pitting longer than a clean bolt beside it. None of this proves a single lost trick. All of it suggests combinations of steps that ordinary factories no longer try. Then come the notes. New notes are better than most that came before. Temperatures, times, measurements, photos, and failures lined like footprints you can trust. A forge in a far valley teaches a garage 1,000 miles away to try a different wood, a different pause, a different quench depth. The web becomes what caravans used to be. A road for techniques to travel, branching, rejoining, changing. Humility threads through the excitement. The seekers know they chase a moving target. Each ore body differs. Each fuel breathes its own way. Hands vary. Seasons lie. What works in one place fails politely in another and refuses to explain why. The note in the margin is simple. Attend. The more closely they watch, the more the metal rewards them with hints. If modern smiths, with forums, microscopes, and patient cameras, still cannot fully match some ancient results, the conclusion is not that the past was magical. It is that continuity matters. Lineages compact experience in a way no manual can. Standing again in front of the fire, night after night, they are rebuilding those lines, not by worship, but by work. When the heat dies and the room cools, the seekers leave their pieces on the bench and sleep knowing weather will test them by morning. Some will bloom with orange freckles. Some will remain calm, oily, as if remembering an older age. Either way, the next run is already forming. The story has not ended. It has changed rooms, learned new tools, and kept the same desire. To ask iron to tell the truth about what careful hands can still coax from earth and fire. Here, now. The rumor does not wear a cloak. It wears a badge. In a building with mirrored windows and quiet parking lots, an elevator opens into a corridor where the air smells faintly of solvent and ozone. Behind a final door, machines murmur while trays of test coupons dry beneath filtered light. On the wall, Non-disclosure agreements hang like invisible curtains. A technician brushes a dark liquid across a panel of steel. A camera records the sheen. A chart prints numbers that will never appear on a brochure. Outside, rain frets at ordinary rails. Inside, metal is treated like a secret worth guarding. Trade secrecy is older than billboards. The old guilds guarded furnaces with oaths. New guilds guard benches with patents and contracts. The impulse is the same. Protect the hard-won edge. If a team spends years coaxing a microscopic film to grow tightly over iron, shutting out salt like a lock shuts out water, why publish the timings and concentrations that made it work? The advantage lives in the details. How long the bath rests, which pre-treatment cleansed the grain, when to rinse, when to wait. A missing half step turns excellence into average. Across a different fence line, the language shifts to code names. Defense projects specify alloys that must not fail in vacuum, brine, or flame. Somewhere, a hinge circles the earth and refuses corrosion with monk-like discipline. Somewhere, a submersible fitting sleeps in cold, crushing dark without pitting. The results are measured, archived, quietly celebrated, and kept. A coating that outlasts paint tenfold does not debut on garden tools. It serves where budgets are deep, oversight is formal, and curiosity stops at the security desk. The public meets a brand name, the lab meets a recipe. Consumer goods drift far from those rooms. A pan must be cheap, a bike light, a tool photogenic on a pegboard. If a finish fails early, a warranty absorbs the moment. A new model appears, and the calendar advances. Processes that ask for patience, aging baths, slow cures, careful pre-cleanse, are trimmed because minutes are money. The shelf price decides how much protection the metal receives. We confuse what is common with what is possible, and assume the ceiling is low because the showroom roof is. Sometimes a hint escapes as paperwork written to reveal and conceal at once. A passivating layer comprising phosphorus-oxygen complexes grown under reducing conditions. A nitrogen-bearing pre-treatment, promoting uniform film nucleation. The words are correct and bloodless. They name the branches, not the leaves. A curious reader can sketch a path. Only the shop with the true timings can walk it. Elsewhere, an academic paper measures a thin, glassy skin on an obscure alloy and calls the result promising. Then funding moves, the students graduate, and the trail cools. Secrecy is not always cynical. It protects workers from harm, gives companies time to understand what they have made, and prevents careless imitation from turning good chemistry into bad headlines. Yet secrecy also bends our sense of reality. We begin to believe that the best we can buy is the best that can be built. We forget that behind quiet doors, materials are routinely pushed farther than catalogs admit, simply because talking less pays better than talking more. Are the most resilient rust-resisting methods hiding in labs, used daily for narrow tasks and never named aloud? The careful answer is that it would be strange if none were. Electronics, optics, and batteries all keep superior versions for specialized clients. Metallurgy likely does the same. Perhaps the calmest surfaces of our era live on satellite skins and deep-sea housings, in tunnels where air is drier than any museum, on components designed to be touched only by technicians with gloves and checklists. The pattern rhymes across centuries. Once, a master locked a door and swore an apprentice to silence. Now, A server locks a folder and a project manager closes a meeting at the word classified. The effect is similar. Knowledge becomes local, procedures become private, and outsiders misjudge the impossible because the best examples are invisible by design. We call ancient endurance mysterious. We may someday call present endurance proprietary. Either way, the gate remains closed. What we can say softly is this: the ceiling is higher than the showroom roof. Durability on the shelf reflects budgets, not limits. And if some doors hide kinder ways to teach iron how to grow old slowly, that is simply the anvil's oldest reflex. Keep the circle small. Keep the advantage close. From this corporate hush, the path narrows again, not into boardrooms, but into hearts, where secrecy is no policy at all, only a feeling a person holds when the thing they know becomes the way they know themselves. Keeping a secret changes the room you live in. At first, it feels like a warm coat, protection against cold winds and careless hands. Then it becomes a key you cannot stop touching. Pride settles into the seams. You know the step everyone else is missing. The pause before the quench, the order of the rinses, the angle that turns a good edge into a calm one. People nod to you without knowing why. The craft recognizes your touch. The town brings you problems and leaves with solutions. Power makes vows feel rational. The old smith swore the apprentice to silence and to guard the shop. The modern engineer signs an agreement to guard the firm. But beneath the paperwork or the oath lies something human. The fear that, without the trick, you would be ordinary. If the recipe leaves your mouth, does your name leave the door? If your timing becomes a document, does your value become replaceable ink? To hold a secret is to hold a mirror that flatters and threatens in the same glance. Belonging deepens the knot. Inner circles feel like home. In guild halls and conference rooms, in Slack channels and side labs, language evolves that outsiders cannot quite pass. Jokes point at procedures. Nicknames hide materials. A shared silence builds trust faster than a shared handbook ever could. To betray the silence is to lose your place at the table. To keep it is to feel the table belongs to you. Over years, that belonging can smooth the edge of conscience until the decision to share becomes unthinkable. Time complicates everything. The keeper grows older. The world shifts beneath his feet. He means to write the method down and never does. There is always another job, another season, another repair. He plans to teach a successor, but waits for someone ready. Someone with the right hands, the right patience, the right loyalty. Sometimes that person arrives and the line continues. Sometimes the keeper is too exacting, or the apprentice moves, or illness comes between them like a wall. Then the recipe remains in one body until that body fails. The knowledge dies politely, still sworn to secrecy. Ego is not the only culprit. Fear for safety often closes lips. A misused step can crack hot metal, spit chemicals, bite a hand. A half-taught method can damage a shop's reputation or a person's life. Better, the keeper thinks, to lock the door than to risk a careless copy. This protective instinct can be noble at the beginning and harmful at the end, because protection without succession becomes erasure. There is also tenderness. People love what they make, and love is possessive. The keeper watches a blade cool and thinks, "That is mine." Not because it sits on his bench, but because it carries a rhythm only he hears. To publish feels like replacing a voice with sheet music. What if they play it badly? What if they play it well and forget the singer? To love a craft is to fear its dilution. We stand at museum cases and call the missing steps mysterious. Sometimes they are simply personal. A habit that grew from one person's hands does not fit easily into another's. The pressure in the grip, the length of a breath, the confidence to stop early, all of it resists translation. You can film the movement and still miss the decision that happened behind the eyes. The line, "do as customary," in an old margin is not laziness. It is honesty about the gap between words and touch. If knowing the trick becomes someone's identity, what happens when time takes the person but not the need? The town buys import tools. The lab switches vendors. The shrine hangs a bell that rings slightly thinner. No scandal announces the loss. The secret fades like a scent, and people call the absence a riddle because they cannot point to the day it began. We are left with artifacts that age better than expected, and processes that almost work, nearly match, almost hold. Almost is the echo of a keeper who meant to speak and did not. From here the question shifts again. Even if every heart opened and every method traveled, metal would still answer to the places it lives. The next rooms are not guild halls or labs, but oceans and orbits, deserts and moons, environments that teach us, again, that matter keeps its own counsel and forces our hands to learn new patience. Push metal beyond familiar weather, and its manners change. In orbit, there is no rain, no sea wind, no kindly film of moisture to slow reactions. There is vacuum, sunlight that bites without air to soften it, and a thin cloud of atomic oxygen eager to strip surfaces like a patient thief. Coatings that behave beautifully on Earth sometimes chalk or erode up there, turning hard gloss into powder. Pieces that never touched water acquire a different kind of rust. Layers broken by thermal whiplash as the craft swings from day to night every 90 minutes. Dive the other way and the rules bend again. At depth, water is not gentle. It is heavy and electric. Pressure pushes ion by ion through microscopic gaps. Currents deliver fresh oxygen the way bellows feed a flame. A screw that would smile through decades on land sulks within months below the thermocline. Add biofouling, organisms building cities on steel, and corrosion becomes a partnership between life and chemistry, nibbling at edges with patient teeth. On Martian plains, the air is thin, the dust is sharp, and nights bite hard. Iron there would meet a cocktail of cold dryness, and fine abrasive grit that sneaks into seals and scours films thinner than a breath. On Venus, everything is soup. On icy moons, cryogenic temperatures turn metal brittle as glass. Each place lays new rules over the same elements, demanding answers no handbook from home can offer. Failure is not dramatic, it is incremental, a quiet rearrangement of atoms that adds up to loss. Engineers respond with libraries of tricks. They grow conversion layers that anchor paint like roots. They design sacrificial anodes to die so beams may live. They choose alloys that make corrosion products compact instead of flaky. And they teach surfaces to become their own armor. In labs that simulate oceans, deserts, and orbits, metal learns new etiquette. A hinge that would seize in brine is persuaded to glide. A panel that would chalk in vacuum is taught to shrug and stay whole. The circle back to the past appears where conditions pinch. A remote station cannot schedule repainting. A probe cannot return for service. Suddenly time matters like it mattered to a mountain village before the first road. and patience becomes an engineering requirement. Processes slow down. Layers are allowed to cure. Heat is applied evenly, then paused, then applied again, because rushing invites failure at miles per second or meters below waves. The discipline feels antique and perfectly modern. Ancient smiths knew their own extremes: salt spray, winter breath, volcanic soil, marshy ground. They tuned metals to local weather the way sailors tune sails to wind. Today, we do the same with more instruments, but the heart of the work rhymes. Observe longer than you feel necessary. Accept that some steps cannot be shortened without paying somewhere you cannot yet see. Trust that matter answers to patience as much as to force. Tomorrow's materials will live in stranger rooms. Lunar dust will scratch every hinge and seal. Hydrogen will whisper through walls that look solid. Towers will rise where wind salts steel with desert. We will ask for metals that resist, remember, and repair themselves. Surfaces that heal microcracks, films that regrow after a scratch, skins that adapt to sunlight and shadow without complaint. Some of this will arrive from elegant chemistry. Some may return by way of humble craft. If our metals fail on distant worlds, where no paint crew can climb and no harbor can tow us home, we may find ourselves turning back, not to new machines, but to old instincts. Warm the piece more evenly. Let it rest, stir the bath, wait a day. In a future of vast distances, patience will not be nostalgic. It will be structural. So the story widens and closes at once. Whether in a forge, a clean room, an ocean trench, or low Earth orbit, iron listens to its surroundings and to the hands that shape it. The path ahead may look like wizardry, but it will likely feel like something older. Attention paid without hurry, choices made without pride, and surfaces taught to grow old with grace wherever we dare to place them next. Iron is a quiet mirror. It remembers the hands that touched it the way a river remembers stone under stones. By changing shape around them slowly, faithfully, without noise. Stand before a dark column that has stood in rain longer than countries, and you feel years pressed into its skin. The color is not merely grey. It is dusk made solid. Along that calm surface runs a diary without pages, a record of heat and hammer, of evenings when someone waited a heartbeat longer before the quench and taught the metal to grow old with grace. Memory works in the same shy, relentless way. It does not announce itself, it accumulates. A breath here, a word there, a moment held slightly longer than necessary. Time oxidizes thought as surely as air works on iron. We paint against it. Photos, names, stone carved with dates. And the coats hold for a while, until a sharp season chips them, and the weather of forgetting creeps in. Yet some memories behave like protective films, compact, tight, faintly self-healing. They are formed by attention more than by ceremony, by small repeated acts that teach the mind how to keep its edge. Think of the images we have carried through this story. A bell that keeps its voice through 1,000 storms. A hinge that moves as if rust were only a rumor. A tool lifted from damp soil, still shaped for a hand that no longer exists. Each is a sentence torn from a longer book. The chapters burned in wars, were scattered by trade, were swallowed by the ordinary hunger of years. The lines that remain ask us to guess the plot. We piece together the shape of a craft from the shadows it left behind, and our guessing is a kind of love. A smith once struck iron until it listened. He learned the color of readiness the way a parent learns a child's footsteps. He knew the moment the bright stopped being heat and became harm. He understood that cooling could be kindness if done with patience, and violence if done in pride. He tightened his grip against trembling, and he taught another pair of hands to wait. That lesson reached a blade, and the blade reached us, crossing centuries as if they were only distance, not time. People vanish, materials persist. This is the bargain we make without being asked. Someone pours a life into a practice so that a hinge may swing, a bell may speak, a gate may hold. When the hand is gone, the hinge continues, the bell continues, the gate continues, as if they had their own quiet will. Standing before them, you feel the unearned intimacy of holding what another person hoped would outlast them. That hope is the truest alloy in any enduring thing, the invisible element that hardens purpose without making it brittle. Trauma breaks both iron and memory with the same blunt efficiency. A fall, a fire, a shock too sudden for structure to catch. After, we see jagged edges and invent a story about strength we should have had. But most loss is slower. Moisture gathers in corners. A habit is neglected. A name is not spoken this year. Recovery looks the same in both worlds. We sand carefully. We seal. We promise to maintain. We pay attention, which is the only real preservative either mind or metal understands. The only ritual that works after the smoke clears. So look again at the relics. The pillar in rain, the bell in the tower, the tool rising from earth like a fossilized intention. These are not only proofs of technique, they are proofs of care. Someone refused to hurry. Someone accepted the long cost of doing a small thing correctly. That refusal bent time. The iron remembers it, and in remembering, it teaches us how to treat our own vanishing stories. With patience, with order, with the courage to stop when enough is right. If a single bar can outlast a city, what is it trying to remember for us? Perhaps nothing dramatic. Perhaps only steadiness. The discipline of routine. The mercy of restraint. The grace of hands that stop when the work is right, rather than when the clock allows. Perhaps it remembers a way of seeing in which durability mattered, because tomorrow was not promised. That way of seeing has a taste, a temperature. We can learn it again. From here, the metaphor becomes a promise. If memory is a metal, we can tend it. We can choose which stories we polish and which we let turn to dust. We can keep a small light burning in the rooms where details live, and write down the steps that feel too simple to forget, because those are always the first to go. And once we admit how easily the past thins, we cannot help turning toward the present with a question. What, among our own tools and habits, will we keep bright? And what will we allow to rust away? Some things we guard like flame in a wind. Others we leave on the porch and trust to weather. Walk any city and you can see the choices made in haste or love. A monument stands inside its careful fence, rinsed by steady hands, documented in thick binders that list the paints and cloths and hours required to keep it gently unchanged. A workshop a few streets away sleeps with its windows broken, machines still bolted to the floor, iron skins in slow conversation with damp. Two kinds of memory, two budgets, one calendar racing on. We tell ourselves that importance decides which objects receive care. Often it is simply convenience. The bell in a famous tower will be oiled. The hinge on a back door will sing to itself until someone moves away and the song becomes someone else's problem. A factory that once fed a town will close, and its tools will become nothing but weight to behold. The techniques that made those tools useful will travel for a season in the mouths of the last workers, then settle into silence because no one wrote the steps that felt too simple to forget. We also mistake novelty for value. The new is loud, the durable is quiet. A device a year old receives updates, a tool 10 years old receives dust. We standardize parts until the part of us that notices texture goes dull. When a process asks for patience, we call it inefficient and move past without asking what it purchased for time. A calmer surface, a kinder aging, a way of failing that does not take the whole with it. The ledger shows saved hours. The ledger does not show lost futures. Imagine a person centuries from now holding a fragment of one of our machines. The materials will still speak. Aluminum light as breath, stainless bright as frost, composites that feel like bone. The fragment will carry marks we consider obvious, and they will read them like puzzles. A notch that meant safety will look like decoration. A code that meant origin will look like art. They will whisper, "How did they do this?" And the answer will depend on what we chose to leave behind. Clear manuals and tender stories, or a tangle of vanished links and passwords to dead doors. Preservation is more than keeping an object dry. It is keeping its sentence whole. The order of steps, the reasons for pauses, the feel of the moment when enough happens. These are the parts that vanish first because they are harder to store than metal. We can save them, but not by accident. It takes a habit as deliberate as tempering. Document simply, teach with patience, name the why as well as the what. A notebook written for a stranger is a bridge across years. A video made without showing hands is a gate that looks like a wall. There is tenderness in repair. Each time we mend a thing, we declare it worthy of a future. A chair glued true, a kettle retinned, a lock coaxed back into honesty, a blade given a day of rest and oil. These small acts defy the arithmetic that says replacement is cheaper. They also train attention. The person who fixes learns to notice the line between wear and neglect. The way a surface changes exactly when it asks for care. Over time, that noticing becomes a cultural weather, and the objects under it age differently. None of this requires scolding. It asks for permission to choose slowly in a world that rewards speed. We can keep archives breathable and shops alive. We can pay the last craftspeople to teach, not merely to produce. We can fund the boring parts of preservation, labels, drawers, consistent light, and treat them as creative work, because they are. In doing so, we decide which mysteries our descendants will inherit. If someone in a far future picks up a piece of our world and whispers, "How did they do this?" let them find more than the hush of absence. Let them find a chain they can follow, a note that names a furnace, a photo that shows the angle of a hasadas, a paragraph that admits uncertainty and records a guess. We cannot keep everything, but we can choose what rusts last. And having chosen, we can return to the work with quieter minds, knowing that our keeping is not hoarding, but hospitality. The kind that invites another century to sit, listen, and continue. Before the final ember dims, there is a pause in which gratitude fits. We have walked through rooms where iron learned to behave like memory, past pillars that ignore the calendar, touched hinges that still answer after storms forgot their own names. None of these objects placed themselves in the world. Someone lifted ore, woke a fire, watched color, and chose to stop at the exact moment grace began. That person is gone. Their work is not. The gap between those facts is the space where our thanks belongs. The first debt is attention. The people who made these enduring things did not hurry through the steps that looked small. They cleaned a surface before someone told them it mattered. They waited for heat to soak the heart, not just the skin. They stirred the quench because their teacher did, and learned later why. We repay that by noticing as they noticed, by looking closely enough that the obvious turns luminous again. The second debt is honesty. We can admit that not every survival is mystical, and still honor the patience that made it possible. We can celebrate the part science explains without letting explanation diminish wonder. It is a relief to say both, that composition, environment, and method account for most of the miracle, and that a remainder persists, shaped by breath-length timings and instincts recorded nowhere but in hands. Humility is not a bow. It is a straight spine facing an old fire. The third debt is transmission. Knowledge that stays admired but unshared behaves like water in a sealed jar, clear and useless. We can write plainly about steps we understand and be brave enough to describe the steps we only feel on. We can ask those who still keep the older ways to speak in rooms where microphones work, and we can pay them as though they were engineers, because they are engineers and poets and historians who speak in heat. The fourth debt is mercy, to materials and to ourselves. We can design things to fail gently instead of catastrophically, to signal their need rather than hide it, to grow old with a beauty that invites care. We can forgive the slowness of processes that purchase a calmer future. Mercy toward tools becomes mercy toward people who must maintain them, and the loop tightens in a human way. Finally, there is the debt of acknowledgement. When we hold a blade that has refused to die, we are holding a decision someone made long ago to work well when no one watched. That decision did not arrive as thunder. It arrived as quiet competence repeated until it became character, and then culture. We can let that shape us. We can choose to be the kind of makers, managers, and neighbors who leave behind objects and notes that do not embarrass the next century. If your tools outlived you by 1,000 years, would you hope that someone and somewhere would notice what you tried to do? We are that someone. We are the somewhere. Our notice completes a circle the maker began. It says, your time was not wasted. Your attention still works. Your care still holds. In answering like this, we take custody of the future tone of things. The debt is quiet, but it is not small. It asks us to tend both metal and memory, to link method with meaning, to treat craft as a way of telling the truth slowly. Pay it, and the path forward clear too. The last questions gather themselves for a final shape. Did ancient blacksmiths truly know a metal trick that modern science cannot explain? Or did they practice a way of seeing that made explanations unnecessary? The ember brightens once more, and the room leans closer to the forge, ready for the answer hidden in the fire. We have walked around the question for a long time. Now we step into it. Did they know a metal trick we cannot explain? The truth glows like iron at low red. Not a single spark, but a steady heat from many coals. Relics that shrug at rain. Forges treated like quiet temples. Rituals and recipes are murmured across generations. Laboratories that still frown at tidy graphs. Together they point to an answer both simple and unsettling. There was likely no lone ingredient hidden in a jar. There was a constellation, orwards, with helpful traces, furnaces tuned by walls and wind, hammering that closed subtle wounds, quenching baths, seasoned by ash or oil, and above all, timing learned by bodies that lived beside the fire. Each part seems ordinary until it is bound to the others by patience. Break the chain and you get good iron. Keep the chain and sometimes you get iron that ages like stone in a riverbed. Modern science can name most of the pieces. We can measure films, map carbides, list impurities. What we cannot reproduce on command is the living rhythm that stitched those pieces together for centuries without interruption. Lineages smoothed the rough edges of chance. Masters noticed what the weather did to color, what the moon did to cooling, what the same fuel did on different days. These notes were written in muscles more than ink, and muscles forget when the work stops. So the careful answer is yes, and not quite. Yes, some ancient blacksmiths repeatedly achieved outcomes we still struggle to summon at will. Not because they owned supernatural secrets, but because they upheld a culture of attention so continuous that chance became practice. And not quite, because the mystery is smaller and greater than a trick. Smaller because most of it fits inside physics. Greater because recreating the whole requires a patience our age seldom rewards. If there is a lesson in the calm, dark sheen of that stubborn blade, it is this. Matter yields to manners. The way we meet it decides how it grows old with us. The real art was not an herb or a powder, but the willingness to stop, to wait, to notice when the glow shifted from hot to harmful. In a world that moves by deadline, that kind of noticing feels exotic. It is only human. So we close the circle where it began. A blade under a lamp, older than the stories told about it. We can explain much of its endurance, and still it keeps a little privacy, like any good work of the hands, except that modest privacy. Let it guard the wonder while the rest becomes method. Then carry the method and the wonder together, as the smiths did, into whatever you are shaping next. Because the trick was attention worn into habit, patience made visible, and trust in processes slow for applause. That we can learn, that we can practice. And if we do, the blade will still speak. Keep the forge as a metaphor and let it warm your room. What the old makers taught is less a list than a posture. Stand near the work truly long enough to hear it answer. You carry your own anvil in the quiet place where attention sits. The question is what you will heat until it changes you back. Start small, choose one thing that matters and treat it as they treated iron. Lay out tools so your hands fall into right places without looking. Remove hurry, the weigh scale is brushed from a blade. Then begin. Notebooks are bellows, they feed the coals. Rest is tempering. It returns toughness after the hard blows. Practice is a quench that must be entered fully, not half-hearted, and lifted at the moment when heat becomes harm. When you meet resistance, think of the smith watching color. He does not shout the metal into obedience. He waits for the tone to change, for the brightness to shift from harsh to held. In your study, your craft, your relationship, there is a similar moment. Quiet, almost private, when pushing harder will only crack what you hope to strengthen. Gently try again with smaller blows, closer together, in better rhythm. Curiosity is the hand on the pulse. Ask questions as if they were sparks. Small, frequent, illuminating. Why did this work yesterday and not today? What changed that I did not see? Which steps do I skip when no one is watching? Write the answers where time can find them. Your future self is an apprentice. Teach them gently and precisely, and they will return the kindness by saving years you would otherwise lose to guessing. Patience is not idleness. In the forge, it is practiced movement, a choreography that protects edges and builds strength where it will be needed later. Make your routines feel like that. It is not glamorous to clean tools, to label jars, to file notes. People call these acts secondary. They are the hinge on which durable work swings. You can borrow their mercy too. Design your efforts to fail gently. If you miss a day, let your system bruise rather than break. Build redundancies that catch you like a trough catches overheated steel. Remember that perfection is brittle. Draw the temper of your own expectations so they do not snap when the world cools without warning. Above all, practice stopping. The old hands knew when enough was right. They trusted a finish that looked quiet instead of loud. End your days with edges that do not cut the hours that follow. Leave something for tomorrow's you to pick up with pleasure, not dread. If a forgotten smith could speak through the iron in your hand tonight, perhaps the advice would be simple. Hold what matters steadily. Feed the fire, not the noise. Let attention harden into care, then let care widen into craft. The rest is time doing what time does, shaping you into someone whose work endures beyond the heat. The room is small again, the lamps low. On the table lies the blade that would not rust, the same dark shimmer that opened our walk, now closing it. We know more, and we know our limits. We can say how films form, how certain traces help, how a pause can shape years of aging. We cannot speak for the held breath before the quench, the weather someone felt in their bones, the thousand slight decisions no camera records. Between explanation and what remains lives the ember of mystery. Lean closer. The surface does not shine. It listens. The color is evening. The texture a quiet river smoothed by hands. In that calm skin are rooms we traveled. Pillars in rain, bells on towers, gates that still answer, forges like temples. Labs that frowned, workshops awake at midnight, archives that smelled of ash, seas and stars teaching metal new manners. Each room offered a word. Together they spell a sentence we can finally read. Attention changes the future. Someone without a name once arranged ore, flame, hammer and water until they spoke together. They did not plan for microscopes or night screens or for us. They wanted a tool that behaved with dignity, a surface that would not betray its owner when weather turned mean. The blade accepted that wish and carried it forward, as quietly as rain carries salt. It outlived the voice that asked it to. What should we carry away? Not a myth of perfect metals, not hunger for secrets that leave others outside. Carry the slower instinct. Pause when a pause will save a structure. Finish when the work is ready, not when the clock permits. Write down the steps that feel too obvious to forget. Let your craft, whatever it is, age like this iron, with calm, with mercy for the person who will hold it next. The lamp hums. The ember in the mind burns small and steady. We set the blade back into its cradle. A door opens to the corridor, to the city, to weather we cannot command. Somewhere far from here, another fire starts. Another pair of hands chooses patience over hurry. As the room fades, one question remains like a thin protective film. Which will rust first? Our metal or our curiosity? Let the screen go dark. Keep the ember. Keep the question. Carry it quietly into tomorrow, and let patience choose again.